What's up, guys? It's Daniel here from Me at the Pianos, and today I'm going to be reviewing the brand new Kid Cudi album, Man on the Moon 3. Kid Cudi has been an incredibly interesting artist for me to follow throughout the years. Obviously, I haven't been with him since the beginning, but it's still been really interesting to see him being brought up by Kanye and then developing into his own artist with his Man on the Moon series. And up until now, it had just been the first two, Man on the Moon 1 and Man on the Moon 2. And I can't necessarily say that I thought that they were as good as some people did. I definitely liked them a lot. I thought that they were great, interesting albums, but I also felt like Kid Cudi had a lot of room to grow. He didn't always make the most focused concepts, and I felt that sometimes he thought that he was making more profound statements than he actually was. But when he just focused on talking about his struggles, his mental health, without any of the other frills, I thought that that's when he was at his strongest. He has a really unique and beautiful voice. Obviously, great humming. That's what he's known for. And again, some really great introspective and vulnerable lyrics that have connected with a lot of people and is the reason why he's this famous. And I think that watching him over the course of the past decade, his journey has gone through so many turns, especially on his highly controversial Speeding Bullet to Heaven, which some people thought was one of the worst albums of the decade. I personally think, while in certain conventional cases it might be considered bad, that doesn't really matter to me because it's one of the most tortured and beautiful albums I've ever heard. It's a man on the brink of losing his entire concept of sanity and trying to hold on to it in any way that he can. Whether Kid Cudi was intentionally doing that or not, I think it's an incredible portrait of how vulnerable and unstable you can be when you're that close to losing everything that you have, including your sanity. But thankfully, Kid Cudi, it seems, has gotten better. He's made some more upbeat, uplifting albums. He's had that collaborative project with Kanye in 2018, Kids See Ghosts, which is one of my all-time favorite albums, one of the albums that really just got me into how beautiful music could be. And I think it felt like a perfect ending point for both Kanye and Kid Cudi, where they had both come to terms with the opposite sides of their mental illnesses, with Kanye's being super loud and all over the place, and Kid Cudi's being more quiet and painful in different ways. And yeah, Kids See Ghosts, in my opinion, is the best thing that Kid Cudi has been a part of. Reborn is the perfect song talking about his mental health and perfectly illustrates what I mean about him just being vulnerable without any of the frills. And I was really excited for this album. I was really hoping that some of those ideas, that passion that he was getting from Kids See Ghosts with Kanye would carry over onto this album, and he would be making that same really beautiful, deep, and layered music that he was making. And unfortunately, not super to my surprise, this album isn't really that. I might have wanted it to be that, but I really shouldn't have expected it to be that. It's still a pretty interesting album at 18 tracks and almost an hour long. It's kind of a concept album in the same way that the first two Man on the Moons were. There's sort of 4 different acts being played out here, but I don't think that the concept behind it is super strong. I've seen some people piecing together threads of narratives throughout the album, but the truth is that in the order that the tracks are in, a lot of the time it just doesn't really make that much sense why one track would be in a certain place and another track would be in another place. I feel like it would have made more sense for Kid Cudi to become more and more self-aware of his own problems, at least in the beginning of the album, before fully dealing with them, because that's kind of what the concept of this first act is. Him living this party lifestyle, this crazy hedonistic life, and then slowly starting to realize how much it's destroying him. But it seems like he already knows that from the very beginning of the album on Tequila Shots, which I think is one of the best tracks on this album. Tequila Shots kind of contrasts this party lifestyle with Cudi talking about how he has this war that's raging on in him and that he's really struggling with every single day. And while obviously on its own, I really respect the song and the message, and I really do love it. But when you take a look at it compared to songs that are later on the act, such as She Knows This, which shows no self-awareness whatsoever, it just really confuses me as to why the tracks weren't maybe switched around, especially with Another Day coming right after Tequila Shots and kind of carrying on those same themes. The idea of every day feels like it's just constantly the same, and he's just living the same lifestyle that he can't seem to break out of. But still, I can't say I was really expecting the most cohesive narrative from this album, and I do still think it's cool that he's continuing to address these topics, even if it might be a bit fractured. But moving over to the instrumental side of things and the sound of this album, I mean, you can't deny that there's not Travis Scott influence on this album all over it. And I don't think that that's necessarily the worst thing ever. Travis Scott, I think, has the most forward-thinking sound in all of trap music, with his kind of psychedelic, reverb-heavy sound. And I don't think that Kid Cudi absolutely just completely copies his sound, but it's very noticeable. And again, that's not much of a surprise. That was kind of the direction that he was always leaning towards, especially with those rock influences that he was taking from. And just seeing more of this makes sense, but it is still a little bit disappointing that I don't feel like Kid Cudi fully has his own identity on this album. Because again, the things he was doing with Kanye on Kids See Ghosts didn't really sound like Travis Scott, even though it did sound like Kid Cudi's style. So I know that he is capable of taking this style and making something completely unique out of it, like he could have on Free Part 2, where he was totally doing that rock stuff and that kind of psychedelic stuff, but on his own terms. This album just feels like a step back a bit, in really every sense of the word. I don't know if I would say there's any moments on this album that could parallel the beauty on something like Reborn. And I don't want to spend this entire review just comparing this album to Kids See Ghosts, because I know it's its own thing. But I still think it's worthwhile to notice that he was kind of doing something that I felt was more genuine on Kids See Ghosts than here. But that's not to say that there aren't still some pretty great moments of vulnerability on this album, like on Mr. Solo Dolo Part 3, which, while I don't think is the best of the Solo Dolo series, I do still think that it's a really great track where he's opening up on about some of his insecurities and some of his worries. And along with that, I think that Sad People and Elsie's Baby Boy are both also great compliments to this kind of vibe, especially Elsie's Baby Boy, which might just be my favorite song on the entire album. It has a really, really great guitar line, and it actually does feel like he's doing something really unique on this song. Not necessarily lyrically, but definitely on the instrumental side compared to the other songs that we've seen. Lyrically, he's kind of talking about his upbringing, he's talking about his mom, and how hard it was for him as a kid, especially with his dad leaving, and I think he mentions his pet dying. And, you know, it's not necessarily, like, delved into the deepest, but it's still a really, really great song, and he really is able to make this concept super beautiful. And conceptually, I think that The Void is definitely the best song on this album. It's the song that makes me think the most. It's all about how he says that he'll fall into the void to avoid getting stuck in depression and the same stuff that he keeps getting stuck in. And that's really fascinating to me because in my head, I would think that the void is those things. And so as I've been listening to this song a lot, I've been wondering about, like, what does really the void mean? Is the void actually depression and all those negative things that maybe he tries so hard to escape them that he ends up falling into them? Or maybe the void is a good thing. Maybe it's something that he's saying we really shouldn't be afraid of, that we should be willing to embrace. I don't know. It's something I would really like to hear him talk more about. But I still think that it's really interesting to analyze and to discuss. However, I just don't really know if there's much else on this album that I think is really amazing to discuss. There's a lot of tracks that feel kind of repetitive and lack any kind of progression, like She Knows This, or even though I really love the xylophone sample on Heaven on Earth, it doesn't really go anywhere. And even if those songs did have interesting concepts, it just didn't pan out very well. Or there's Lovin Me, which was probably the biggest disappointment for me on this album, because it was featuring Phoebe Bridgers, who made Punisher one of my favorite albums of the year. And so I was really hoping that she was going to bring something amazing to this. I mean, she has an incredible voice, and I thought that she was going to be doing something super powerful. Unfortunately, her voice feels extremely subdued. I can barely tell the difference between her and Cudi if I'm not paying attention. And while that low-key voice works well for Cudi, for Phoebe, I just really wanted more. I didn't really see much of a point in bringing her on the album if you were going to underutilize her skills. The best part for her vocally is when her and Cudi are both humming, which is a really beautiful moment on the song, but unfortunately the rest just feels so boring that it doesn't really feel worth it to sit through the song to that point. And of course I can appreciate what the song's about, learning to love yourself, but it just really didn't do much for me. And really, that's kind of a common theme on the album. The features aren't that great, which is really disappointing. I don't think there were any tracks with features that I actually enjoyed. There's Show Out with Pop Smoke and Skepta, and while I do actually like Skepta's verse on this, the rest of the song is absolutely horrible. Pop Smoke's hook is insanely boring, and the song just has no other redeeming qualities. Kid Cudi's verse is just and I really just cannot stand that hook. And this song, even more than others on the album, just makes no sense for me based on where it's put on the album. I just don't know what it's supposed to mean, and it makes the concept of the album kind of lose any meaning that I was hoping it could have. This just felt like a really unnecessary song, and almost just felt like a kind of cheap way to get Pop Smoke on the album, even with a kind of lackluster hook. But even worse than Pop Smoke's performance is Trippie Redd's performance. Now, I haven't really listened to much of Trippie Redd's music, but oh my gosh, I cannot stand his voice. He's on this album on Rockstar Knights, and it really is just unbearable for me. He does both the hook and I think the first verse, and man, I don't know if that's what he usually sounds like, but I just can't really get it, especially with Kid Cudi's vibe. Maybe if it was a totally different vibe that suited him better, I would be able to enjoy it a bit more, but this just does not work at all. It's like a kind of chill, stoned out vibe. So those two songs were immediate skips for me, and it really is a shame because I think it maybe could have worked, but I just don't really understand what Kid Cudi was trying to do with it, and it just feels like he didn't really know what to do with features in general on this album. So yeah, this just felt really disappointing, especially in a lot of the middle section. It just felt like there's a lot that could have been trimmed from this album, and I felt that way about the first two Man on the Moons too. I don't really see why Kid Cudi feels the need to just include way too many songs that just a lot of the time aren't really that good. Because I still think that Kid Cudi can make some amazing material. I don't know why he's insistent on trying these other things and being overly ambitious when it just doesn't work out at all. However, I can say that I think the album started really strongly, Tequila Shots, Another Day, and I think that it ends super strongly with the last two tracks. For the Kidz is a pretty solid song that, while at this point of the album I just felt kind of tired of the album, when I was just like, okay, I'm not going to listen to this within the context of the album, just listen to it on its own, I really did enjoy. You know, it's one of those songs where Cudi is kind of trying to send a message to the kids at home, you know, just giving them a lot of advice about growing up and being lonely and how it's all going to be okay. And it really is a great song. And I really appreciated that point on the album, especially because it felt like he was reaching a really good conclusion to the album, kind of trying to share his wisdom with other people. And Lord Knows definitely delivers on that closer, really continuing what For the Kids set up for it. It's a great closer to the album and to the trilogy as a whole, with Kid Cudi kind of looking back at everything, kind of thinking about where this has all led him and all the trials and tribulations that he's been through and just reflecting. He called it a spiritual hymn, and I think that that's pretty close to the truth. It's a really great closer to the album, even though there's been a lot of inconsistencies. And, you know, maybe there's an issue with me appreciating this album just because I felt like Kids See Ghosts was that conclusion. And so maybe it was hard for me to see this album as being the conclusion to Cudi's solo discography, or at least this section of it. But I don't know. I just couldn't help but feel very underwhelmed by this album. There were too few really great songs on this album. There were songs that had some interesting concepts, but just really didn't go anywhere. And while I can appreciate the aesthetic, and while on first listen I did think that he was taking too heavily from Travis Scott, I've kind of come off of that now and been able to appreciate they just have kind of similar styles, and Kid Cudi can still do his own thing within it. But my biggest issue is really just that he kind of underserves his skills. He's not really making that beautiful music that I know he can be creating. And I feel like he's kind of stuck between the two audiences who kind of want just a hype Cudi or a kind of more beautiful Cudi. And I don't know. I don't really know what exactly Cudi fans want. But judging from the reaction to something like Kids See Ghosts, I feel like it should have been more of that. Maybe just on a solo album. But yeah, I don't know. This was just disappointing. I really hope that Kid Cudi, you know, comes through with something a bit more cohesive, beautiful, interesting in the future. But for now, I'm feeling about a 5.2 on this album. But that's just my opinion. Just let me know what you think. I've never been the absolute biggest Cudi fan. So, you know, if you're a Cudi fan and you want to let me know how wrong I am or how right I am about this album, just let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. If you could find some kind of narrative thread throughout this whole album, that would be great. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if there's any other videos you'd like me to do. I'm going to be doing my year-end lists fairly soon, hoping to get a few more reviews out. But besides that, have a great rest of your day, everyone.